As part of the CFF site's preseason preview series, this is the second installment of the schedule analysis, the second of four shows where on this show we're going to look at the ACC. We're also going to dip into the AAC and knock out Conference USA all in one show. And like I mentioned on the first show that we did with the Big Ten, we're going to spend most of our time on the power conferences because as you get into the smaller conferences, the AAC, the Conference USA, you're really not looking at so much of the great matchups because the entire conference is made up of great matchups. What you're really looking for are the roadblocks, the potholes in the road, the ones that you may want to try to avoid, whether it's earlier in the season or at the end of the season. But we're going to go ahead and kick this second show off with the AAC, and Conference USA. And just want to give my man Sprague a shout out one more time. Got that Central Michigan helmet up there. Support your team. Get them into the CFF site. If you want to support your team, get your helmet up there. The office address to the website is on the bottom of the CFF site's homepage. So I'm going to continue to promote that until we get these shelves filled. But with that being said, let's get into the schedule analysis and let's see, we got the ACC. So let's go ahead and jump into it, guys. And so we're going to go ahead and start right there at the top. We'll go from top to bottom. We'll start with Boston College and work our way down. And so let's just go right there with Boston College, right? You're looking at Fordham, at Michigan State, at Stanford to open the season. 2 road games out of the first 3 matchups. Still not bad, though. Those are not bad matchups, in my opinion. A really good start for maybe, running back Turbo Richard. When you look at the AC schedule, and, I've put my eyes on the schedule, and here's the one thing that I feel about the the ACC. I don't necessarily feel that there's many bad schedules in here. I feel like the ACC is just wide open. Kind of feels like Clemson's the team to beat, but you have a few other contenders in there, such as maybe SMU. How does Miami look this year? Is a team like Pitt really going to be a player? I don't know. Georgia Tech, based on the schedule, when we get to them, I think they're in a good spot this year. But when you look at that schedule right now for Boston College in particular, I really like the first half of the schedule, the Fordham, Michigan State, Stanford, Cal, Pitt matchups. It's really once when you get to that Clemson matchup where you really have to be on alert. You've got Clemson, you go on the road to Louisville, you get Notre Dame, you get SMU, you get Georgia Tech, all within week after week after week. I think that's the part of the schedule for Boston College where you really have to be on alert, but you go ahead and take advantage of that early season schedule. And I think a player like Turbo Richard could be a nice find on draft day, and I think he could pay benefits the first half of the year. Then we go over to Cal. You got that road matchup to start things off at Oregon State. You got Texas Southern right there before they get to that matchup with Minnesota, at San Diego State, at BC. Again, I look at Cal's schedule. Remember, Cal was one of those teams where I think they lost 87 running backs before at post spring, right? Here, I look at Cal's schedule and I was like, you know what? Nice schedule. Like if we can identify some assets in that Cal offense, I think there's some fantasy value there, but we have to be able to find those assets, particularly at the beginning of the year. Once we come out of that Oregon State matchup, maybe that matchup against Texas Southern, see who the RB1, if it's rock solid. But when I look at the Cal schedule, I don't see many roadblocks, right? They don't have any matchups against Miami. They don't play Clemson. I don't see Florida State on there, Georgia Tech. I really like the Cal schedule. It just depends on what kind of personnel we get coming out of that and what kind of fantasy assets we get. Now let's go over to Clemson, right, where they have that opener against LSU. But after the opener against LSU, I think the Clemson schedule is just go ahead and sail away, right? And I don't even think that opener against LSU is even going to be that difficult when it comes to. I think that's 2 teams that we were talking 5-6 years ago. We'd be like, okay, Clemson, LSU, you gotta have to watch out for the defenses. But both of those clubs plan to be offensive. I think they're going to be more offensive than they will defensive. That's just the way the college game has evolved. I look at that Clemson schedule, and again, is there really a bad matchup for Clemson anywhere on their schedule? I would argue that the better the matchup, the better the fantasy potential for Clemson, because then you're not going to get into situations where you've got 3 touchdown leads in the middle of the fourth quarter, right? So I really love the Clemson schedule. I think it's really made for a big season for Cade Klubnik. Let's see what happens at running back. Is it going to be Adam Randall? Is it going to be a couple of the, maybe one of the young guys as well? Love the Clemson schedule. Let's go over to Duke, where you look to opener against Elon. You've got Illinois. You've got a road game against Tulane, NC State. That's again, I'm just saying this. I think really it's not until you get to the Syracuse game on the road where there's a part of the schedule where you look at Duke's schedule and it's like, you know what, if you're going to be kind of careful around that part of the schedule, maybe that's where it's at, right? You've got a road game against Syracuse, road game against Cal, which is cross country. You got open Georgia Tech, open Clemson on the road, right? And so 2 open dates in that stretch match up against Clemson. Really, when you look at that 6 week stretch, 2 off dates, 3 road games, right? So we'll see what that brings as far as the schedule goes. Florida State, let's look at Florida State's schedule. The one thing that really jumps out at me with Florida State's schedule, particularly after the Alabama opener, is how good the schedule looks from weeks 2 to 5, right? I mean, Kent State, at Virginia, I really, what's really going to be big to identify fantasy assets at Florida State is we know that Castellanos is going to be the quarterback, right? Who's going to be that running back one that really emerges for the Seminoles in Gus Malzahn's offense? Will we get that player sooner than later, or will we have to wait 4, 5, 6 weeks into the schedule before that player emerges? We'll find out. But the value in the Florida State schedule is in the first 2/3 of the season before they get on that back end with the open date game at Clemson, game at North Carolina State, game at Florida to end the year. So I look at the Florida State schedule and say the first 2/3 is really where the value is, the best value in that Seminole schedule. Then we go over to Georgia Tech, opener on the road at Colorado. You've got, I mean, this is the one schedule where I look at and I was just like, there's a lot of people that wonder how good Georgia Tech can be this year. And I'm just like, I just don't see many roadblocks on this schedule until, you get on that road matchup against Colorado, you get the home matchup against Clemson, right? Once when you get out of that matchup against Clemson, it's Temple, it's Wake, Virginia Tech, Duke, Syracuse, NC State, Boston College, Pitt. I can see a scenario right now for Georgia Tech where they drop that Clemson game, maybe staring the college football playoffs in the eyes in that final week matchup against Georgia. Now, not saying they're not going to get tripped off. I do think the road matchups at the end of the year against North Carolina State and Boston College could be a little tricky for Georgia Tech. But remember, this is about fantasy. This isn't about college football playoff. And when I look at this schedule, that matchup against Georgia all the way in the championship week of head-to-head formats, the only matchup that you really have to be cautious of is the week 3 matchup against Clemson. And quite frankly, that's a home matchup. I'm not sure I'm really sitting the good Georgia Tech assets at that point anyway. So let's go look at Louisville now. Eastern Kentucky, James Madison, open, Bowling Green on the road to Pitt, Virginia. Like, man, I really love the first half of the Louisville schedule. Then it's really once when you get to the back half where it's open at Miami, at Virginia Tech a couple of weeks later. Then they get Clemson, at SMU, and Kentucky to close the year. I don't think that this is a bad schedule at all for Louisville. The only part I do not like in this Louisville schedule is if you get to the college football, if you get to your fantasy football playoffs and you've got the matchups with Clemson, at SMU, Kentucky, weeks 12, 13, 14. To me, that's the only part of the schedule where that would concern me just a little bit. Then we go over to Miami. We look at Miami's schedule with the opener against Notre Dame. Then you get the 2 matchups against Bethune-Cookman, South Florida, which are really nice. And then you get another tough matchup against Florida. And then look at that schedule, right? Open at Florida State, open again. I don't love this schedule if this schedule does not make me want to jump on any Miami players early unless I'm getting them at value. We'll see who emerges at running back one. I think really what you have to hope one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. You're really hoping you've got the right running back once when you get to week 8 because you got the opener against Notre Dame, not favorable. You've got week 4 against Florida. Okay, that's going to be a tough defense as well. Then you go open. Then you go to the road on. Then you go on the road to Florida State. Then you go open again. So when you look at those 2, 4, 6, the first 7 weeks, Notre Dame, Florida, open, open, and Florida at Florida State could be a tricky game too. I don't know if we're going to give. I don't know if Florida State's getting enough respect. If they can just get that offense turned around, I think their defense is going to be okay. That's one, two, three, four, five questionable matchups there in the first 7 weeks for Miami. But then you got to love the back end, right? You've got Louisville, Stanford at SMU, Syracuse, NC State. I mean, the back end of the schedule right there, the last third of the season, Syracuse, NC State, at Virginia Tech, at Pitt could be golden if we have some really good Miami players at that, once we get late into the season. North Carolina with the opener against TCU. Then when you get Charlotte, you get Richmond on the road against Central Florida. I think all of these matchups are really good. I love the North Carolina schedule for the first 4 weeks. The biggest thing is that there's a lot of unknown with Bill Belichick taking over. You've got Gio Lopez that's going to be the quarterback. Remember the transfer from South Alabama. How much confidence will we have to really start him in that opener against TCU? Do fantasy owners kind of take a pass, balk on that week 1, then decide to say, okay, looks good. We like what we see out of the Tar Heels offense. Let's get him in there against Charlotte, against Richmond. Let's get him in there against Central Florida. And then you go open, Clemson, open, right? So that 3-week schedule right there, you're not really going to get much from your North Carolina assets, in my opinion. And then you got Cal, Virginia, Syracuse, Stanford, Wake Forest, Duke, North Carolina State to end of the year. Like, I really love the beginning of the schedule for North Carolina, the end of the schedule for North Carolina, and it's really just avoiding that 3-week period and maybe arguably 5, just because they go to Central Florida, cross country to Cal. So maybe that open Clemson, open at Cal. Those 4 weeks might be the weeks where you're a little hesitant on your North Carolina players because in 2 of them, you're not going to start them at all. North Carolina State, I'm a big CJ Bailey fan this year. I think North Carolina State can be I think we can get some good fantasy production from Bailey and Smothers, maybe Noah Rogers, see what Jolie does at tight end as well, another good asset. Look at the schedule. East Carolina, Virginia at Wake Forest, at Duke, Virginia Tech, Campbell. Then you've got to get all the way to week 9. Once when you get a road matchup against Notre Dame and you're open, those 2 dates right there, questionable. Travel to Pitt, Georgia Tech, open at Miami. Okay, Florida State. Okay, maybe the last couple of dates in the schedule in the college fantasy football playoffs, that week 12 and 13 at Miami against Florida State, maybe that presents some problems. But when I look at this schedule, the first 2/3 of the schedule, the only matchup that really makes me a little nervous is the matchup at Notre Dame. Let's go to Pitt. They start off with Duquesne, Central Michigan, West Virginia, Louisville, Boston College. Like, that's a great start right there. If you've got Desmond Reed, you have to feel really good with that schedule right there as long as he can stay healthy. That's the big thing. Boy, he could put up some big numbers in that first half of the schedule. Then 3 of the next 4 weeks are on the road at Florida State, at Syracuse. You've got that North Carolina State matchup at Stanford. But again, do any of these matchups really scare you on paper right now? Not really. Maybe at Florida State. Then you've got the Notre Dame matchup there at the end, at Georgia Tech, Miami. There's really no ACC matchup, in my opinion. When you're talking ACC versus ACC, there's really no matchup that scares me. The only one that really makes me nervous is when you're looking at maybe where you kind of Clemson, the maybe Florida State, see what their defense does, Miami, Notre Dame. When you've got those games in a small mix, that's the only thing that makes me nervous in regards to schedule. SMU, when you look at the SMU schedule, first 4 games look really good. I don't know what doesn't look good on the SMU schedule till you get halfway through the year, right? Baylor, Missouri State, TCU, Open, Syracuse, Stanford. Then you've got to go to Clemson. That's maybe the only matchup. Wake Forest, easy matchup on the road. You get Miami at home, at Boston College. You even get Louisville at home. Man, I really love this SMU schedule. Great schedule for Kevin Jennings at quarterback. Let's see what happens with the Mustangs at running back one. That's really, in my opinion, the big key. Will we get a true running back one emerge for SMU, or will it be running back by committee all year? But I love the SMU schedule. Going into Stanford, opening up in week 0 against Hawaii on the road. Why does that matter? Well, that's one more bye week that Stanford has during the year. They go to BYU in week 2. So you're not going to really, if you're not using your players in week 0, road matchup at BYU could be tough. I don't know if you're going to get anything from Stanford players, maybe till week 3. You got when you look at the middle of the schedule, you've got the open date, the game at SMU, Florida State at home, Miami at home. I do not like that 4-game stretch at all. Notre Dame in week 14 to me is kind of irrelevant. You've got to be in the college fantasy football, your championship game anyway for that to matter. I don't think Stanford's schedule is bad. The question is are we going to get much in regards to fantasy assets from them? And if we do, then what we have to watch out is just for that stretch in the middle of the schedule where we were talking about SMU, Florida State, Miami, and the open date. That's really the ones to avoid. And hopefully before that, we can identify some good Stanford assets. We go to Syracuse, and this, I'm a little torn on Syracuse this year. They go out and sign Angeli from Notre Dame post spring. Ricky Collins could possibly start. One of those two guys are going to be a quarterback. What I'm a little concerned about is whether or not we see a rotation from Syracuse at quarterback this year. And the reason I say that is I feel that Syracuse, in my opinion, may have one of the toughest, if not the toughest schedule in the ACC this year. They open up with that matchup against Tennessee. Then they play UConn and Colgate. Great. Those 2 games, you're going to get some points out of your fantasy assets. Then they go on the road to Clemson. My concern is that somewhere between that Tennessee and Clemson game, somewhere with those 2 matchups, I'm wondering if there will be anything that happens in those games that might spark some sort of quarterback rotation. Those are going to be 2 decent defenses Syracuse is going to be playing against, and Syracuse, remember, they're rebuilding the offense. So just because whoever opens up the season as the Syracuse starting quarterback, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make it through that Tennessee matchup. You have to feel good. You have to wonder whether those matchups against UConn, when you get to Colgate and then you get to the road game against Clemson, it's like, okay, will we possibly run into a roadblock there and see a rotation? And then you get the Duke matchup at home. And again, another road matchup at SMU. For me, that's one of the, possibly the 2 tougher defenses, 2 of the tougher defenses in the ACC. And then you figure on the back end of the schedule, they're playing at Miami. They're playing at Notre Dame. And when you look at this Syracuse schedule, you think about all the points they averaged last year. They have to play Tennessee, Clemson on the road, SMU on the road, Miami on the road, Notre Dame on the road. And remember, we talked about Georgia Tech being a player in the ACC this year as well. That game on the road, right? So all of their tougher matchups in conference are actually on the road. And so that bodes well for the home games. But like I said, there's not many of them on there, considering you got 2 open dates, and week 14 is against Boston College, North Carolina, Pitt, Duke, Colgate, UConn are really the only very attractive games. And like I mentioned at the beginning, I thought the ACC schedule, when I look at it on a whole, I don't see a lot of bad scheduling on here for teams. For me, I think Syracuse has probably the toughest schedule in the ACC. Let's go down to the Cavaliers, where they open up with Coastal Carolina at NC State. You've got William and Mary. You've got Stanford. That's 4 really good matchups right there for Virginia to start the year. Then they go Florida State at Louisville, an open date. That's a 3-week stretch where it's like, okay, maybe there's a little bit of a warning sign right there. But then you get Washington State at North Carolina, at Cal, Wake Forest, Duke, open, Virginia Tech. Nothing scares me the rest of the schedule for that Virginia offense. Going down to the Hokies, Virginia Tech, that matchup against South Carolina to open the year. Vanderbilt in week 2. Then they get Old Dominion. They get Wofford at NC State. Wake Forest. I mean, I look at this schedule. You've got to get to the back end, right? Look, in the last 2, 4, 6, last 7 weeks, 2 open dates, road game at Florida State, and a home matchup against Miami and a home matchup against Louisville. That's not the greatest schedule right there, but I really like how the first part of the schedule kind of opens up after, that matchup against South Carolina. And look, here's the one thing I got to give to Virginia Tech, and I tip the hat, the hats to them. They're playing 2 SEC teams right out of the gate, but I don't think either of these 2 SEC teams are really going to bring enough defense to where you really need to be overly concerned about starting Virginia Tech player. The question is who opens up at running back 1 there? Is it going to be Terry and Stewart? Is it going to be Bennett? We just don't know. And so, if anything, maybe the opener against South Carolina gives us a really good idea of what that depth chart is going to be throughout the year. And then we end the ACC with Wake Forest. Remember this, for me, Wake Forest feels like a year 0 situation. I do not think that they have the quarterback that they necessarily need to run that Ezel offense. But we'll see how that pans out. They get Kennesaw State to open the year. They get the other easy matchup in week 2, NC State week 3. Georgia Tech, at Virginia Tech, at Oregon State. I mean, that's the part of the schedule, really, if there's anything cooking for Wake Forest and it takes them a little while to get going. Look at that stretch with the road games. At Virginia Tech, at Oregon State, open SMU at home, at Florida State, at Virginia, right? So that stretch of the schedule might be a little tricky if we can get some Wake Forest, production. And I think the biggest question for Wake Forest is going to be, who's really, one, is there going to be a lock solid quarterback 1? I have a feeling we could see some rotation, and that puts Wake Forest players at a little bit of a risk because depending on who quarterbacks that team, whether if it's Ashford or Purdy, that's a difference of a skill set right there. Ashford's going to be a little bit more athletic and mobile, move around a little bit. That means not as much value in the passing game, where Purdy is inserted in there, he gives a little more value to the receivers because he's got to sling it around a little bit more because he's not as mobile, right? So a lot of questions still around Wake Forest. The one thing that we do know is that Damon Claiborne is going to get a lot of touches in that offense. And so when you look at that schedule, I think the one thing that you just think about is, where's the roadblock for Damon Claiborne? And I look at that schedule and I just say, he's going to get his touches anyway. No fear for me from the Wake Forest schedule. I think where the questions come in is just at the quarterback and the receiver spot. So that takes care of the ACC, and we're going to go ahead and try to just skim through some of the other conferences real quick. Like I mentioned, we're going to go ahead and kind of get into the AAC, go ahead and get into Conference USA. Here we go. AAC, and again, like I mentioned, there are not going to be many bad spots on these schedules. These are non-power conferences. I think the key thing is can we identify maybe any troubling spots for some of these teams? So we're just kind of walk through these with you. UAB, where's when you look at that beginning schedule, Alabama State, Navy, Akron, Tennessee, Open, Army. When you look at UAB's schedule, for me, the only thing that really is troubling is just the beginning of the year, right? You're going to play Navy, which is going to be a run-heavy, clock-running game. You got Army just a few weeks later. You've got the open date and the matchup against Tennessee. I think really for UAB is if we can identify who the assets are in week 1 and see production from those players in week 3, then I think by the time we get to week 6 and 7, I think you're going to be good to go for the rest of the year. I just like the way the schedule opens up at the end of the year. So for me, the value in UAB's schedule is at the end of the year. When you look at Army, is there really a roadblock for Army? Because what you see, what you get with Army, they're going to strap it up. They're going to come at you. I don't really see anything on the schedule that scares me for Army. I mean, playing on the road at Kansas State, maybe. That's the only matchup that would alarm me right now for Kansas State. But when I look at the rest of the schedule, nothing on there really jumps out at me as far as maybe, except maybe, the road matchup at Tulane, road matchup against Air Force in that open date. But again, once again, I'm not sitting any Army guys if they've proven, particularly if Dwayne Coleman really proves himself to be a good fantasy asset at the quarterback spot. You look at Charlotte there, they're just opening up with Appalachian State and North Carolina. For me, that would be, if is Charlotte assets really going to be a viable thing this year? We're going to see. You've got the road matchup at South Florida, road matchup against Army. You've got that matchup against Georgia and Tulane later on in the year. We'll see how that plays out. Don't really love the schedule on the back end with those last 2 weeks, but how many of us are really going to be taking Charlotte players into the college fantasy football playoffs with us? I don't think we really will. I think the key thing is do we get a spot starter that emerges sometime in the first 2 weeks? Will we be able to identify a player to come out of those first couple of weeks to maybe take advantage of a few matchups throughout the year? East Carolina, there's going to be a lot of ECU players on rosters this year. Matchup against NC State to open the year. I think that's a really look. That's not a matchup for ECU. I think the only matchup that you would have to be a little concerned about might be the matchup against BYU, and that's a home matchup. You know, that would be the stretch for ECU if I'm saying there's a stretch to be nervous about. That week 4 matchup against BYU, you follow that up with a matchup against Army, which we know what Army can do sometimes to fantasy potential. Then you get the open date. Then you get the road game against Tulane. That 4-week stretch would be the one that makes me nervous for an East Carolina player, but the schedule opens up on the back end. Florida Atlantic. Remember, we're going to expect the Owls to sling it around a lot. So where are the hiccups on the schedule? Is it that opener on the road against Maryland? I don't know. Maybe. I kind of feel like they're still going to be able to get their points there. Again, when you look at the matchups up and down, nothing really makes me nervous about this FAU schedule. We're predicting a big season for Easton Messer, Caden Veltkamp. Let's see if we've got some other good receivers that emerge out of that. The only matchup I would say that is even, possible to be worried about would just, again, the road matchup against Navy, just because we know what Navy and Army can do to the clock and keep it running if they can control the ball. But I'm not going to sit any of my FAU assets in any of those matchups anyway, because I'm not convinced that the Navy and Army defenses are that good. You just got to worry about limited possessions. That's all. When you go to Memphis, you look at the Memphis's non-conference slate. You've got Chattanooga, you've got Georgia State, you've got Troy, and you've got Arkansas. Really, that matchup against Arkansas would probably be the only one that makes you nervous. Again, you're not really batting an eye at any of these schedules right now. Navy, again, VMI, UAB, you're not really nervous about anything on that Navy schedule until you get to the end of the year with that road matchup against Notre Dame. And remember, that could be a pivotal matchup if you're going into, if you have a Navy asset on your team. That's around the time of year where the college fantasy football playoffs are about to start. That might be the one spot on the Navy schedule that you have to be concerned about. And it's not necessarily just because it's Notre Dame, but it's against Notre Dame and when it is against Notre Dame in the schedule when you could be battling for your fantasy playoff life. North Texas, again, you look at the non-conference games. You've got Liberty, you've got Western Michigan, Washington State. So again, there for me, nothing, and South Alabama, nothing really scary on that schedule for North Texas for the Mean Green. When you look at Rice, ULL, maybe the matchup against Houston is concerning a little bit. You got the matchup against Prairie View A&M, Charlotte Navy. Again, Houston maybe the only matchup that gets me a little nervous, but it really depends on what kind of assets we're going to get from Rice anyway. Right? South Florida, is it a bounce back year for Byron Brown? That's going to be the big question. Here's what I would say against South Florida. I've said this on one of our previous shows that Mike and I did, that beginning third of the schedule when you've got Boise State, Florida, Miami, and those other two of those games are on the road. That's the part of the schedule that makes me nervous for Byron Brown because we're expecting a bounce back year from him. Is it a confidence thing? And if it is a lack of confidence and they don't pull themselves out of that through the first three games, or they struggle in the first 3 weeks of the season, I can see where that could be a long-term thing. I remember last year, I was like, hey, wait till the schedule softens up and Byron Brown's going to be golden down the stretch. It never did happen. He got injured and we never saw him again. So I think there's two things that need to happen if you have Byron Brown. One, he's got to make it out the first three games healthy. And two, you want to see him producing because I think that confidence will carry over through the rest of the year. And again, that schedule is going to open up nicely. It's South Florida, when you look at the entire AAC, has the toughest non-conference schedule of any team that we're going to be talking about. Temple, same thing, right? Howard in week 2, UMass. When you get to week 3 and 4, you've got the Oklahoma matchup against Georgia Tech. Then they go on the road. That's the 3 week stretch where you have to be a little bit concerned. But outside of that, you're okay as long as we get some value from Temple and we have players on our roster. UTSA, we're going to have assets on our roster from UTSA. I always like when the toughest matchup is the first week of the season because I can go for, I can plan for that one. Like there's no plan, in my opinion, to use a UTSA player in week 1. But when you look at that schedule afterwards, you're in the clear after that. So UTSA, nervous about week 1. You're not starting any assets there, but then it's clear all the way down the line. Tulane opens up with Northwestern out of the Big Ten. Then they've got South Alabama. They've got Duke. That's going to be, wow, Darian Mensah. Tulane hosting their former quarterback, and then Tulane's got the road matchup at Ole Miss, right? So it's just whether or not Tulane can navigate a couple of those spots, maybe the game against Ole Miss, see what Northwestern brings and what their defense can bring. But you're not really going to be sitting many of your Tulane assets, maybe, just maybe again, the game against Ole Miss. But look, we know Lane Kiffin likes to run up the score, so it's going to be starters. He wants to maybe give up a few points because Ole Miss is going to want to score a little bit. We'll see if that Lane Kiffin comes through. But I think the big thing for Tulane when we get to that point is, do we identify a true running back one in that offense at that particular time of the season? Will the running back one emerge for Tulane, and who will that be? And right now, I think it could be one of 3 players. But as we come out of that matchup against Northwestern, as we come out of that matchup against South Alabama, I think that's what we're going to be looking for more than anything. Does Tulane go running back by committee, or do we see a true running back one? Because we all know that the value in the Tulane offense is at running back. Tulsa, to round out the AAC, you look at that schedule, nothing to write home about. Got the road matchup against Oklahoma State and the matchup against Tulane, Memphis in week 4, 5, and 6 with the open date. That would be the only dates where maybe you would be a little concerned. But in regards to the schedule goes, you're going to start your Tulsa players week 1, week 2, if we really know who they are, right? Here's the thing when we're talking about schedule analysis. We talk about these really good matchups in week 1, week 2, week 3, but if you're not really sure who the lock solid starters are going to be, those are the matchups that you want to take advantage of, but they also may be the matchups where we can't take advantage of them because we do not know what the depth chart's going to be or who they're going to rely on that earlier in the year. So then you miss the opportunity in week 1 and week 2 from a Tulsa player. And then you kind of get the Navy, Oklahoma State, Tulane road against Memphis. So don't love the first half of the Tulsa schedule, but if we can get some fantasy assets emerge, I think the end of the year, you're looking a lot better. And that's going to run us through the AAC. Let's jump right into Conference USA. And as I mentioned with AAC, when you get to these conference schedules like Conference USA, there's really not a lot of bad scheduling, right? As a matter of fact, there's a lot of things you want to take advantage of in these conferences. I find what you're going to do, what you're looking at as far as full FBS leagues go, these are the conferences where you get fantasy assets emerge out of the first 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, and where the waiver wire becomes incredibly important to your season. And when you're looking at matchups in a conference like Conference USA, you're not really looking for great stretches. What you're looking for are the stretches to avoid. And when I look at the Conference USA schedule from top to bottom, there's really not a lot there that scares you, right? When you look at, let's just go right down the list. Delaware, right? On the road at Colorado. When you look at the rest of the schedule, you've got to go all the way to week 13 to find a power conference team in Wake Forest. And that one's not going to scare you off of any Delaware assets by the time you get to that part of the season. You look at FIU on the road against Penn State, right? In week 2. That's the only thing that jumps out at you. When you look at Jacksonville State, is there anything there that really scares you? Even if that matchup against Central Florida on the road scares you off of the open and week 1 matchup. Kennesaw State, right? Are we really even going to have assets for Kennesaw State in the first 2 weeks of the season anyway? But by the time you get to the matchup against Merrimack in week 3, maybe the matchups against Wake Forest and Indiana have established some sort of depth chart, and it's given you a big enough sample size to determine whether or not if there's even a player worth having on your roster from Kennesaw State. Let's look at Liberty. There's a reason why I love Ethan Vasco this year. It's because of the Liberty schedule. When you look at it from week 1 all the way to week 13, 14, the only matchup that may make you a little bit nervous or make you pause would be the matchup against James Madison, and that's a home matchup. When James Madison is the toughest team on the schedule for a team like Liberty, you have to really like that schedule. The big question is who emerges as that top B back in the Liberty offense. That's the one thing to really track in those opening couple of weeks. Louisiana Tech, same thing. Week 2 matchup against LSU. It's the only thing that really scares you off of them. Middle Tennessee, yeah, road matchup against Wisconsin. Again, week 2. Where else do you see any fear? Nowhere. Missouri State at USC to start the year. Week 3 against SMU. But with these teams, we're going to need 2 or 3 weeks to identify who the top players are on the roster anyway. So really, for some of these group of 5 conferences, particularly these teams in Conference USA, when we're talking Louisiana Tech, when we're talking Middle Tennessee, when we're talking Missouri State, sure, New Mexico State, where Yost now is the offensive coordinator, sure, there are going to be some fantasy assets that we think are going to emerge, or could be some weekly options for you during the year. But I'm not necessarily positive that anybody's coming out of the gate firing with fantasy assets off of any of these teams anyway, right? So the beginning schedule doesn't really hurt you. Except maybe in the case in Sam Houston and Western Kentucky, we're expecting to get some offense from both of those teams, in particular, especially Western Kentucky. And you've got that week 0 matchup where Sam Houston plays Western Kentucky. What that means is you just have one less matchup from week 1 to week 14 on that schedule. And when you look at Western Kentucky, that means 3 byes and a road matchup against LSU in week 13. Those are the only things on Western Kentucky's schedule not to like. UTEP road matchup at Texas in week 3. Sam Houston road matchup against Texas in week 4. And that's, that matchup against Texas is sandwiched between 2 byes. So there's a 3-week stretch really where, hey, if we find out in week 0, Sam Houston has some good value, are you going to use that against UNLV and Hawaii, knowing that you've got a bye Texas and bye coming up? So that's where you have to determine and strategize. Is it worth rostering a Sam Houston player through the first 5 weeks when you may only get a couple of uses from them? And that's where you start to debate that's when you have to evaluate as far as your league specs go. What's my roster size? How many players can I carry on my roster? Those are the type of stretches that you have to strategize, or you have to think about, is it worth rostering a Sam Houston player at the beginning of the year, knowing I've got a bye in week 3 and week 5 and a matchup against Texas in week 4, right? UTEP matchup against Texas in week 3. And I just talked about the Western Kentucky schedule. So as you look at Conference USA, again, there's nothing there that I think scaring us off of anyone. Now that I've looked at the schedule again, the only thing that really jumps out at me is having second thoughts on maybe rostering a Sam Houston player in the first part of the year if you do not have the roster size that allows you to kind of carry some guys, because if we find out, if we see what we want in that week 0 matchup, then there's a good chance you may start a Sam Houston player in week 1 and week 2, but you're not going to get anything from weeks 3 to 5, right? So those are the type of things that stand out to me when I'm looking at a Conference USA schedule. Again, Western Kentucky, the 3 buys, the week 13 matchup against LSU. Those are the two things that stand out to me, and those are both of the teams that play in week 0. Is the Sam Houston and the Western Kentucky schedules. Those are the things that jump out at me because I know we're going to have some fantasy assets in Western Kentucky, and we're likely to have some from Sam Houston as well. And so, in the grand scheme of things, that's what stands out to me for Conference USA. And that's why it's very quick to go through some of these group of 5 conferences because it's not necessarily the good matchups and stretches you're looking for. It's the roadblocks. It's the 3 week stretches that maybe you need to shy away from, or maybe dictate how your draft philosophy or how you eye some guys or value certain players in draft. So look, that's going to do it for this second show of the schedule analysis. We ran through the ACC, the AAC, and Conference USA. So we're halfway through. We're still going to get through the Mountain West Conference with the Big 12. We'll throw in Notre Dame into the mix with that, and then we'll finish things up with the SEC and Sun Belt. So that's going to do it for the second show of the schedule analysis. My name is Joe DeSalvo, the voice of the CFF site, and I will see you guys on the next show.